Yeah, translation, listen or else. Jamie Metzl is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and CNN's international diplomatic editor, of course, is Nic Robertson. Good to see you both, really. Jamie, first to you. I know that for those of us, all three of us who've traveled all around the world and have seen the good that U.S. aid does, not just for those interests in those countries, but for U.S. American interests being safeguarded around the world, let's put that to one side. Jamie, you know that this works really well for Donald Trump's base, and he seems serious. He's going to actually put policy to those words.
He probably is, and that's what's so concerning. It's true that America gives a lot of support to our allies and friends for various reasons, but one of the big reasons America gives aid around the world isn't as some kind of gift. It's because we have articulated, and past leaders have articulated, the kind of world that we would like to live in, and we have made smart investments in building that world, in building democracy and building free markets. And that takes a give and take. Foreign aid is not just some kind of protection racket where people do everything that we want. What this is about is building alliances, building friendships that endure where friends can have legitimate differences. And if we are having some kind of despotic approach toward foreign assistance, I fear that will undermine our values and ultimately our interests.
You know, Nick, at a certain point in time, the world was used to there being a certain amount of benevolence around the world from the United States and the way they handled this aid, even though a lot of it was tied aid. Some of it was tied aid to human rights. How do you think, especially when you look at allies in Europe, how are they coming to terms with this Trump doctrine, really?
Well, we've heard from President Macron on his speech this afternoon, which is a rebuke in so many ways, explicitly, of a lot of what President Trump has talked about. Indeed, he talks about the importance of working with these international organizations. But I think perhaps if we look at what we've heard from the German foreign minister in recent months about an alternate way of supporting trade with Iran, faced with the possibility of secondary sanctions for the United States on European countries post the United States pulling out of the JCPOA. You know, and then the language, visual language of Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, standing side by side with Federica Mogherini last night, talking about exactly that. And this is the rather the European adjustment. You know, every nation, and President Trump says this, that they should look to their own national interests. Well, the repercussions of President Trump looking to his own national interests are beginning to crystallize in other nations around the world. Last year, people sat and listened to President Trump. They had an idea. They didn't really know the man, and they were going to see what would happen. This year, it's very clear. I think that's where the laughter came so easily, so early, in response to President Trump laying out how great America was doing, because it's almost a caricature of himself and the way that he's understood. So, yes, world leaders have an understanding, and they are looking after their national security interests. And it does mean, you know, the beginning of something that one day may become a marginalization of the dollar. That's getting way ahead of ourselves. But these steps lead to these sorts of things.
It is certainly a risk, and that's why it was so really extraordinary that the Germans were the first to say that, look, we perhaps could come up with another payment system. Jamie, into the vacuum steps China. We've covered it so much on this show. What do you think the risks are then to American foreign policy, and what is China doing actively to try and step into that vacuum?
Yeah, well, I am, as you know, just back from China this morning. And the United States really needs to wake up to the threat that China poses to the world that America has built. And America has built this world based on a set of values, based on an idea that came out of our experience out of the two world wars, that by sharing sovereignty, we don't lose something, we gain something. And ironically, President Trump and the Chinese are both putting forward the same model of international affairs based on national sovereignty. That's what the Chinese are saying in the South China Sea, is that we're going to claim this whole thing, and you, whoever it is, ASEAN or others, should only interact with us on a bilateral basis, and not on a multilateral basis.
Right? We're not going to come there and talk to you about human rights. We don't care about that necessarily. We're coming there country to country, nation to nation.
Absolutely. And so Trump and China are saying the same thing, and what is being pushed aside are America's values that have underpinned the world that we have created out of the ashes of the Second World War. And these concepts of international law, of human rights, of free trade, those aren't things that people did to us. Those are the principles that we espoused that built the world in which everybody has thrived, in which our country has prospered. And so to have the President of the United Nations taking the axe to the very values that have made America great and aligning himself intellectually with the position of the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans is deeply concerning. That brings to your question on China. China has its eyes on the prize of global leadership. And the world led by China will be very different than a world led by the United States. The United States really needs to wake up to that and to try to build that world that we would like to live in.
Yeah, and they're making real headway, whether just as a coincidence, perhaps, under President Trump. Nick, before we go, I'm going to really lean on your experience here with Saudi Arabia. You know, we're going to bring this whole conversation full circle. We had him talking about OPEC. Of course, the most prominent member there is Saudi Arabia. A lot of interesting moves in the Middle East and elsewhere when it comes to this alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United States. Is the United States seeing a long game there when it comes to Saudi Arabia? Because you know more than anyone how well they play at that game.
You know, and Iran plays a long game very well as well, of course. You know, I think Saudi Arabia is going through its own challenges at the moment. You know, ultimately in the near to middle term, there will be a change of leadership, but we know what the new leadership looks like, and President Trump was praising that new leadership, Mohammed bin Salman, the reforms that he's bringing to the country. These are ambitious reforms. Some would say overly ambitious and overreach. We've seen this by Saudi leaders before, talking up grand plans and not following through. My guess at the moment, while they want to have a strategy and are getting support from a lot of, you know, friends and analysts to have a longer strategy, it doesn't seem to think too far ahead. The war in Yemen would be an example. But I just want to go to China here, and I'm sorry because I'm doglegging back out of going full circle here. But I was sitting at a business lunch, a business dinner with several hundred businessmen in Beijing recently, and I was sitting next to a former Chinese ambassador, and he said the concern that we have is that the United States thinks that our economy is growing, it's going too far too fast, and it wants to throttle us back. Now, listen to what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said when he talked about the ancient Greek political, if you will, lesson to be learned, where the Spartans thought the Athenians were growing too fast. They were in isolation, as in Trump's language, separate, patriotic, separate constellations having their own space in the world, but they were separate. And they went to war because one was afraid of how well the other is doing. That's, as you're saying, exactly how the Chinese are beginning to view what's happening. And as Antonio Guterres says, that's incredibly dangerous. And we heard nothing from President Trump that would walk back any of that danger.
It is a good point that if you frame the entire debate, it is, in Trump's eyes, a zero-sum game. Gentlemen, thank you both. Really appreciate it.